Hello and welcome back to another rousing edition of SpyHards SpyMaster interview series. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam, the provocateur.
And jumping onto the podcast this week, we have a very special interview for you. None other than David Franzoni. Now, Cam, tell the listeners a little bit about David.
Yes, so David Franzoni is an Oscar winner. He produced the film Gladiator, which he also wrote. He has a really interesting filmography that includes Amistad, as well as the King Arthur film from a handful of years ago, the one that starred Keira Knightley and Clive Owen. But his first credit, which you wouldn't necessarily connect to like historical epics like those, was Jumpin Jack Flash, starring Whoopi Goldberg from 1986.
You could say he was caught in a crossfire hurricane.
You could, but you might not.
That's fair. Yeah, so we reached out to David, and he was thrilled to jump on board and talk about this film. I don't think he gets many knocks on his door for the Jumpin Jack Flash story. Now, one thing we spoke about in the episode way back, it was episode 10 for us, is David wrote the story and has a screenwriting credit on the film as well. But what his story was not necessarily what ended up on the screen. Now, I don't want to foreshadow what's coming. I'll let David tell the story, and he does it better than I do. So what we'll do is we'll throw over to the interview right now. And joining us on the podcast is the writer of Jumpin Jack Flash and some other films you might have heard of, Gladiator. It is none other than David Franzoni. David, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're thrilled to have you here. This is I think, really interesting movie to dive into, and we had a lot of fun recording our episode on Jumpin Jack Flash, so I'm looking for as much insight as possible.
Okay, well, I hope I don't let you down, but yeah, it is an interesting script, so I'll let you throw the first ball. Go ahead.
Sure.
Well, when we have guests on, we generally like to set the scene a little bit, paint a picture of you. So before we maybe get to Jumpin Jack Flash itself, how did you get into writing?
Yeah. Okay. So ever since I was a kid, I was writing. And all through college, I was writing. But it never occurred to me that I should be a writer. I was actually a geology major. And the moment that I sort of worked up the courage to make the decision to go to Los Angeles and duke it out was in 1973. I was on a motorcycle somewhere in India. And I decided, if I can do this, I can do that. So that's how I sort of dropped everything and came out. Although the geology major stuff does play a bit in the Jumpin Jack Flash.
Okay. So Jumpin Jack Flash rolls around in 86. But leading up to that, do you have any earlier kind of, I guess, flirtings with Hollywood in terms of writing screenplays? Like, what is sort of the process towards leading into, writing for Jumpin Jack Flash?
Well, I was out there for quite a number of years, the archetypal starving writer, break in. The thing that people would say to me, people in the business would say to me is, your premises or your spec scripts are really intriguing, but we sort of don't know where to go with them. And that was the problem for Jumpin Jack Flash as well. I do think the solution was easier than they imagined, but so I was encouraged by the fact that I was intriguing people at least. I had written a monster action picture that never got made. And that got me, it was about 1980-ish, that got me with CAA, which was, I think, just sort of forming anyway. But when I finished the action piece, I decided, well, I need to write something small. I need to prove that I'm a writer, so I need to write a character-driven piece, action or not or whatever. So I wrote Jumpin Jack Flash, and that's the one that sold and got made, obviously, of the early pieces.
Okay, so that brings us on to the origin of Jumpin Jack Flash. Now, you have the screenplay credit and story by credit on the film. So from what I've read, there's a definite transition from the original idea you had to what came in the film. So how did you go about writing that first Jumpin Jack Flash story, and what was it about?
All right, well, okay, so I'm a 60s guy, right? So, It's got to be about something or I'm not doing it. So to me, what this era that I was living in, the 80s, it was about a confluence of vastly different visions or world visions. So let me explain. So my original hero, Jumpin Jack Flash, was someone who had fought in the Congolese Wars. Got that? Okay.
Yeah.
He was a radio operator fighting with mercenaries in the Congolese Wars. That's his origin story in the military. He then segued into British intelligence and so forth. So what I wanted to do, and to me, the Congolese Wars were sort of the last great epic barbarian wars, where you had these mercenaries who thought they were legionnaires and, coming in to just take from the Africans and murder. And it was an era, the last of that sort of horrific but very interesting era. And at the same time, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal was one of the newspapers that I always got. So Wall Street Journal and the Scientific American were my two Bibles. Because if shit was going on, it was going to be in both of those. And one of the things that was going on in an article I'd read in the Wall Street Journal was about bank encryption and relaying funds from one bank to another, the times of nights they were doing it. And at that, back in the day, those encryptions were pretty bulletproof. God knows now. But so we had this world of, the sort of this ex-mercenary who had become a spy, and the girl, she works in a bank, right? I mean, she's not doing anything really extraordinary with her life, except she can handle the encryptions that can baffle and befuddle spies at that point. So she has this sort of weird position in life. So Terry, and Terry has a lousy life. She's, engaged with the wrong guy. Now, this is the original, of course. Mm-hmm. She has, a cadre of friends who are questionable friends. She's living the life that a lot of us live, and with no way out. And one night, Jumpin Jack Flash lands, and she begins this affair over encryption with this barbarian. And obviously, the one with Whoopi that they made steered quite a ways away from all that. But that was the idea. The idea was these huge movements and sort of the world were crashing together. And she was this innocent girl in the middle of it. There was a great scene, I don't believe they shot it, where she was, one night she's in bed with her boyfriend and she starts rattling off credit card numbers, and she'd been fed imidazine, which was a truth drug back then. It was used for cracking spies. Anyway, it was a very complex sort of relationship that would not only just crash in on her, but then ultimately crash in like another second wave on her whole life, sweeping it all away and leaving her and Jack at the end. That was the idea. Now, it doesn't sound like a story, but that was the idea.
Well, that's really interesting because, like what you described, it sounds, because obviously Jumpin Jack Flash the movie is quite a broad comedy in a lot of places, right? And this sounds almost to me like it would have made more sense as something more akin to like Romancing the Stone, where you're balancing serious elements with comedy. When you approach it, how did you imagine it? Because the final version is obviously, as I said, much more of a mainstream kind of broad comedy.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly frank with you, I didn't have a touchstone. It has to be this. In fact, after the studio bought it, and then after the studio sold it to another studio, I was meeting with not every, but a lot of serious directors who were very interested in the project. And they would always ask me, but what is it? And I can't remember which director it was with. I had the script in my lap and they said, what is it? And I handed it to them. I said, that's what it is. And the problem back then, not that necessarily different from today, is that without touchstones, people have a lot of trouble just sort of going forward. my point was, it is what it is. And if it's unique, that's probably better. And I can't pretend to solve the problems that you claim you have, because I don't have those problems. And when they did in fact, the joke for me was I was in London later working with a French director while he was shooting Half Moon Street. And my agent called me to say that they'd signed Whoopi Goldberg to Jumpin Jack Flash. And I said, okay, I said, that's great. Whoopi's fantastic, but does that mean it's a comedy? And she said this or that or that. And I said, well, I'm not sure that it works as a comedy. And she said something, well, they'll take care of that. They fixed everything else. I thought, okay, what does that mean? They fixed everything else. What that meant was they didn't really change a lot. They just yucked it up. Anyway, so I'm not sure if I answered your question or not.
No, you really much, yeah, very much so.
Well, I suppose bouncing off of Cam a little bit then, the original story as it sat, was there any comedic elements to it, or was it a straight spy story?
Well, there was some fun in it. Terry was quite fun. I mean, she wasn't Whoopi Goldberg, but she was quite fun. She had a great sense of humor, very smart. That's why she was able to, in the end, wrangle this whole spy thing down. And she had, in the bank where she worked, there was this sort of menagerie of bank people that was quite fun, actually. In fact, someone said, well, what are you talking about? It was a comedy to begin with. I didn't think that, but it was quite fun. I think, however, the difference in tone was, substantial. I mean, it's not that, see, that's why, okay, so the credits are, I have, first screenplay credit and I have story by credit. The reason I have story by credit is because I created the story. But that means the Guild recognized that the story hadn't been changed that much.
Right.
Or it was the same story, just funny. Although they've taken stuff out, which was, I'm not being negative. I'm certainly not, it was a lot of fun. But I remember being in London, actually when I was in London with Bob Swain, the guy who was doing Half Moon Street, I was at, one night we were having dinner with Sigourney Weaver, and she said she remembered that script. It hadn't been produced yet, but she remembered it and really liked it. Of course, because it was a very strong female character.
Yeah.
So that's how it wasn't totally different. It was just tonally different.
Right. Okay. So I know that pre Whoopi Goldberg, it was seen as a potential Shelley Long film. Did you ever do passes of the script during the process of when you're writing the screenplay? At any point, was that known to you? Like, were you ever writing it towards a specific actor?
Okay, so it was at Lad Company originally. And I was working with a director there. Okay, so what I was trying to avoid was guy saves girl. Boyfriend saves just, damsel in distress. And they kept pushing me that way. So ultimately, they replaced me with a female writer. And I actually never saw that draft, but I understand it didn't work. They then sold it to Fox, where it got made. So I was never writing specifically for an actress.
Okay.
Well, before we maybe analyze what the end result was a little bit, you did touch on this boyfriend character that existed in your version of the story. Looking at the character list now, and I actually rewatched the film just before coming on here, so it's quite vivid in my mind. Did that evolve into the Marty Phillips character played by Stephen Collins in the end? Was that kind of how it was seen?
Basically, yeah. I mean, let's put it this way. I presume so.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Best I can do with that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that here was the issue. The issue was, okay, so I remember when I saw coverage from, I think it was MGM, and the coverage was like, 5-star. In the end, they said, the ending was very moving and all that. The problem for people was, if it's a love story, we got to see the guy. They got to be together. They got to go, get go to get submarine sandwiches together, whatever. They've got to have a life together. But my point was that it was more powerful if you didn't see him. It's like radio drama. You imagine, you hear the Lone Ranger on the radio, you don't see anything. You just imagine what the Lone Ranger looks like. And I think I was very impressed. Did you ever see one of the early Vietnam War movies? I'm sorry, I can't think of the name. It's really good. It had a lot. Okay, it's probably one, except for Platoon, it's probably the best. It had a lot of radio drama. Sorry.
I was just going through the list here of the earlier. I mean, Apocalypse Now is earlier.
For that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It was written by a Japanese or Chinese writer. He was also an actor in it, and I think it was not Kirk Douglas, but anyway, there was the actor they needed to get the show made. But anyway, there was a Go Tell the Spartans.
Okay.
And it's really great. But this is radio. The end is totally radio drama, where they're attacked by the Viet Cong and they're all killed, but all you see are muzzle flashes. Right. That's all you see. And of course, it's terrifying because you don't see people falling over pretending they're dead.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, I thought, well, we can do this with Terry and Flash. We just don't have to see him. He's there. And the way it was written, you felt his presence, I believe, throughout. So, anyway.
Well, that's really interesting because, you use the term, barbarian to describe the Jack character. I don't really think of Jonathan Pryce fitting that term so well. And
yeah, exactly. Jonathan Pryce is a bit more Bondish.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it works in terms of what the movie is now, where it is sort of this more sort of sweet romantic comedy ending. But I do like the idea, as you said, having it more mysterious as to who this character was at the end. So then I have to ask the question. So if we don't meet Jack, does your script end with her continuing on with the boyfriend who was established earlier?
Oh, she meets Jack at the airport.
Oh, okay.
Now I dialed it a little bit. So in the original, when she goes to his apartment, he gives her his address.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She doesn't know who he is, right? I mean, obviously he could be anybody. So she goes to his apartment. She finds some photographs from the Congolese Wars, and there's one of this guy with a radio in his arm running away, with an arrow pointing at it saying "me."
Oh.
You feel like, okay, so he's not a murderer. He's a radio operator. He's a communications guy, just like he is now when she finds him. But he was in this barbarian war, and so it gives him, obviously it gives him a past. It gives him a reality. So that was very important to me. Was that scene? Anyway, so he sees him at the airport. He arrives, and they know who each other are.
Gotcha.
I suppose if we're talking about Jonathan Pryce, and as Cam alluded to, it's a bit of a strange choice for us. Choosing and seeing him at the end of the film was a bit of a surprise. But did you have someone in mind, actor-wise, who you would have cast? It may be in your version of the story. So not to say anything about what came out in the end, but in your version of the story, an actor of the time, who would you think would suit the role?
You mean for Flash?
Correct.
I'm sure I probably did. We're talking about a different era now. Here was the problem. Okay, so yeah, sure, you want Steve McQueen or somebody, but you can't do that because he's not in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Just what he's typing and maybe sometimes saying. So I don't know. We discussed it, and it was the idea that we needed somebody so that when you saw him, your fantasies were fulfilled.
Yeah.
Just the way Terry's were. So it's like, that's got to be him. Right. That's as far as we went with it.
Okay, so the whole tying it around the song Jumpin' Jack Flash. Now, was that there from the earliest versions, or was that something that came later? You say you're a 60s guy, so it kind of makes sense if that was the case. Where did that all start to tie into the story?
No, I gave him a code name, Jumpin' Jack Flash.
Okay.
Period. I mean, I didn't use it originally as a title because I figured I would be sued by the Rolling Stones or something. But
Sure.
that was his code name.
And I assume that was obviously in reference to the Stones song, but it was at the end of it in your script. There was the code name. There was no featuring of a song in your mind or anything like that.
No,
or Aretha Franklin covering it for your film as well.
Did you ever see the rock video that came out of it?
For Aretha?
I did. Yes.
With Aretha, and I think it was Keith. Yeah, that's fantastic. Aretha Franklin. I mean, my God, it's fantastic. Singing "Jumpin' Jack Flash," and I made it happen. Are you kidding me? That's great.
Well, I suppose then, now we've looked at the story originally, and we're now moving on to the film itself and what came and what was put out there. Did you ever see the finished product in the theaters or on home release or anything like that?
Yeah, of course. I went to the premiere.
Right. So obviously you said it was handed over to Fox, I think, at one point towards the end. They were the people that ran it. Was it MGM? You just said who bought it in the end and made the film?
I think it was Fox that bought it.
After that point, were you still involved in the production? Were you around when they were shooting it? Had you handed it off?
2 writers came in to write it funny, and I was, like I said, I was in London working with a French director while he was trying to write with him while he was directing Half Moon Street.
Okay. Now, I know the original director was Howard Zieff. Did you collaborate much with him, or did it get, once he came on board, was it even then kind of passed on to other writers?
It was, no, I didn't collaborate. Look, when I had my directors meetings at Fox, I think they were found to be a bit artsy or something, and they wanted to find a way forward. I wasn't giving them that, of course I was, but they didn't like that idea. And so I can only imagine somebody saying, "Hey, Terry's pretty funny. Why don't we make it a comedy?" So that's only I can imagine. I was not involved.
Right.
Okay. I suppose the last question I have for Jumpin' Jack Flash itself is, why a spy story? What made you want to go down that genre in that area of storytelling?
Well, again, of course, it's not a spy story. The original script. It's a story about this girl.
Okay.
And she's possibly going insane in this late night job she has at the bank, because the audience, there are clues for the audience to doubt her. Mm-hmm. And everybody, even when she starts rambling off serial numbers for credit card, her boyfriend thinks she's lost her mind. And somebody, I can't remember who, somebody figures out what's going on. That she hasn't lost her mind. That's resolved, that it's the truth. But it's not strictly a spy story. It's a story about the coming of age of this girl. She's trying to find, I hate the term coming of age, but she's trying to find her way in this bizarre world. And she, finds it by saving a spy.
What I'm glad to hear is, in your version of the story, there was no scene with Whoopi Goldberg biting the private parts of John Wood. That's the main thing I'm taking away from this. I'm happy for that.
No.
Well, I am curious. Scott brings up that example of a moment within the movie, but when you saw the finished film, obviously it went much more, as we said, mainstream comedy. You've got Whoopi Goldberg as the lead. That's going to shift the tone in terms of what you originally intended. I'm curious, when you watch the movie, outside of the premise, if there was moments or scenes you can recall that felt like your original vision of what this was.
Well, mainly when she was on her own.
Mm-hmm.
When she tries to break into the embassy, that sort of thing where she has to take on the responsibility of a spy or something. She has to become the spy to save the spy. The moments where she is trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Those to me are like, those are from my script. That was what the script was about. We're trying to figure out what the hell's going on in this room late at night at this bank with this crazy son of a bitch communicating with her through fucking bank codes. But it's about us. It's about what's life? She's a young girl. She's out of college. She's trying to figure out what to do with her life, and so we lay a heavy metaphor on that, and we have a Jumpin' Jack Flash,
right?
If you will.
Well, after Jumpin' Jack Flash, there's some other films that pop up that I mentioned earlier on. I know Cam wanted. Well, I mean, the two that spring to mind for me are Amistad and Gladiator. Are the two films. I mean, I've got some questions about Gladiator, but I know Amistad came first, and Cam has a few lined up for that.
Yeah, I was really curious because this is such an interesting point where Spielberg is doing that 2 movies at the same time kind of thing, like he did with Jurassic Park and Schindler's List, and then now we have The Lost World and Amistad. I'm curious what sort of his involvement was even able to be during the process. Like, was this a script you'd been developing on your own for a while that he got attached to? How did that sort of work?
Okay. Right. So I had recently written The Mayor of Castro Street, the Harvey Milk story, Oliver Stone. And so everyone liked it, period. Everyone liked it. So I was hot. And my agents came to me, they went like, Sly wants to meet with you, Arnie wants to meet with you, you know. I'm thinking, well, what am I going to write for them? Anyway, so, but at the same time, an executive from Quincy Jones' company had lunch with me and said, look, Quincy has all these ideas. And so we ran through them. They're basically all about angry vinyl, right? I mean, you know, stealing songs, whatever. I mean, it was okay, but I mean, and the last one she brought up was Amistad. And I remembered, oh yeah, I know the Amistad story. So I said, well, look, let's do this. Let's put a pitch together and we'll take it to Quincy. So we did, and Quincy basically, you know, he said, no, I don't want to do this. This is, you know, he says it's going to make blacks look bad. Where'd you get this stupid idea? Well, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but, and I said, well, it came from you guys. I mean, you pitched it to me.
Mm-hmm.
He said, no, I don't want to do it. So by that time I was hooked. I wanted to do it, period. So began working on it on my own. Anyway, while that was all going on, Amblin was, you know, creating DreamWorks or however that worked. And I went in for a meeting with Walter Parks at DreamWorks, and he pitched me 2 things. One was a sci-fi idea, which wasn't bad, by the way. I keep, you know. And the quote was, now, David, I want to pitch. He asked me, because I also done George Washington for all of us. And it's a pretty good script. And he said, are you sick of period? And I said, no. He said, I'm going to pitch something to you you've never heard. Amistad. And I said, well, you know, over at Warner Brothers pitching this right now. Anyway, so the bottom line was, I met with Steven, and it wasn't that I was developing the script on my own. It's that I was solving problems on my own. Like, I didn't want it to, any more than I wanted to be guy saves girl. I didn't want white guy saves black guy. That was the most important thing. No. So I'd worked this thing out, and I pitched it to Steven that, you know, Cinquet has to handle his own, has to be seriously involved with this case. He's got to be, you know, where Debbie Allen gave me this idea of when you know, Benin is in trouble, they call down their ancestors. So that's why I said, well, let's have John Quincy Adams call down the ancestors at the Supreme Court. And anyway, it was really great. Once I got going with Steven, it was like, you know, Debbie and I are meeting after our meetings with Steven. We're talking about the civil rights movement, the 60s guy, this is great. It was this wonderful experience with Steven, who completely embraced the project without any kind of hesitation. And so I went off and wrote the script, and anyway, he was juggling 2 movies, I don't know, maybe 5, I don't know. But he made it, and he did, I thought, a fantastic job.
Now, you touched on Debbie Allen, the producer, and I know, you know, there was a letter back in '97, I believe you wrote for the LA Times, just about her involvement in the writing process. And I was just curious what hand she played in helping you along with the script.
Well, I mean, look, here's something. What's important about Amistad, or, you know, even like if you look at Jumpin Jack Flash, right? So Flash had to have a life. He couldn't just be this cute guy who beams down at the end of the movie. So he was in the Congolese Wars. He'd obviously experienced, like, somebody like beat up. So I thought, okay, so what's Cinquet's life? You know, who is he? Now, and so Debbie and I used to sit and talk about that. What she knew is that she knew the cultures in depth. She knew the Benin culture in depth. So that's what I'm saying. Like, for instance, calling down the ancestors when you're in trouble. She knew all that. And so we would just sit there and talk.
Mm-hmm.
The world, who these people were, the difference between a freed slave, someone who was never a slave, a freed slave who became an abolitionist. We wanted to make sure that there were some subtle distinctions. Also, what was important to me and what I read at the time was, of course, there was a lot of pressure being brought by the government on the courts to just let the Spanish have them and fuck it, right? And there was one judge, and this is why when you get into the granular nature of these pieces, things really start to resonate. There was one judge who was a Catholic,
mm-hmm.
but he had to keep it secret because everybody hated Catholics back then. Catholics were the Antichrist. And so they basically threatened, the government threatened to reveal him as a devout Catholic and the Antichrist and all this. And I have the scene where he goes in and he prays by himself one night. Now, Catholics didn't believe that you could, like a Protestant, that you could go into a quiet room and pray. It was more like you had to go to church and interact with God and so forth. But he's by himself praying. And to me, those are the scenes that, and also the other stuff that we got into was the philosophical differences between the South and the North. I think it was Hobbes who believed that mankind was perpetually evil. It's sort of like the Republicans today, right? Mankind is evil. Hobbes, you wrote, the natural case of the natural state of mankind is slavery, and those who eat them. I mean, that was the basic position of the South and the Republicans right now. I mean, we're repeating ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
The North, they read Rousseau, the social contract. It was like, it was a different world. So I tried to bring those together too. It was using John Quincy Adams as the mouthpiece of, and Quincy Adams, it said something that what I really believe strongly, which is, if there's going to be a civil war, let it come, and let it be the last battle of the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to work on a piece right now for a French company on Lafayette. And the way blacks have been written and rewritten and written out of American history is disgraceful. So I have this letter from a German mercenary who was fighting with the French. And he wasn't a Hessian, he was regular German. And he was at the Battle of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered, right? And he wrote this letter describing Washington's troops as being 25% black. Now, where do you see that? In any portrayal of the American Revolution, very paintings, right? No, nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go back to your original sources. And, so I felt very strong, I still feel very strongly that the Civil War was the last battle of the American Revolution.
Right.
And the South, especially Virginia, was England. Classist, racist. I mean, that's one of the reasons why at the end of the American Revolution we outlawed titles. Like Steven Spielberg has been knighted, but he can't use "sir" here. We don't do that. Anyway, so.
Well, I'm really interested because when I look at your work of the produced films, they, for the most part, have very, very clear protagonists, whether it's Maximus in Gladiator, whether it's even Citizen Cone, the James Woods character in that film. Whereas this film, you want to base it around Cinque, as you said. I'm just curious, in terms of telling that story, there's so many moving parts with so many characters, how you maintain that focus while trying to be true to history, just the challenges of writing that.
Well, there was stuff that was taken out, but I think, I think it still worked. I think it focused on Cinque. I think, okay, for instance, when I wrote the scene on the Amistad where Cinque pulls the nail out of the deck, after that scene, you remember him. He's not like, don't hit me, master. It's like, I'm going to kill all you motherfuckers, right?
Mm-hmm.
think that weighed a lot, and it also weighed heavily when he starts getting involved with John Quincy Adams, because John Quincy Adams, the former president, he's erudite. He represents sort of an ecclesiastical version of the American dream, but he's got guts, and so they mirror each other. That was the idea, that those two would, rather than John Quincy Adams going, "I'm going to save you, poor black guy," they mirror each other. That was the idea, that they echo each other. If that is.
No, yeah, for sure. Okay, well, maybe Scott, do you want to move over to a Gladiator question?
Yeah, I suppose Gladiator for me, it was one of those films. It came out in 2000. I didn't see it at the cinema. I don't think I was quite the age to see it, but it was one of the first DVDs I ever bought. One of my favorite films of all time. So thank you for that. In terms of a question, my first one is, how did you get involved with the film? I know it's quite an easy question's been asked many times before, but I'm really curious to know how you went from, Jumpin Jack Flash to Amistad to a Gladiator film.
No, Gladiator was first. I in the 70s, I drove from West Berlin on a motorcycle to Australia. While I was in Baghdad, so leaving the West, going through Eurasia, Turkey basically, Romania, there's coliseums everywhere. I mean, they're not, but they're everywhere. So I suddenly realized, holy shit, this is a huge franchise. This isn't just something happening in Rome or Pompeii. This was everywhere. And then when I was in Baghdad, camped out on, I can't remember which river, I traded a book on the Irish Revolution for a book from an Australian girl, for a book called Those About to Die. And Those About to Die, which I give credit to as being an inspiration for Gladiator, wasn't so much that it was literally Gladiator. What it did was it completely, in the synopsis in my mind, bridged who they were and who we are. So it was clearly, so when I pitched it to Steven, after I did Amistad, so finally I get back to, I swear to God that when I was in Baghdad, if I ever became a screenwriter, I worked like hell to get that made into a movie. What I said to Steven was, this isn't about ancient Rome. This is about Los Angeles, 2,000 years from now. CAA represents the gladiators. Ted Turner is Commodus. That was how I laid it out. And I Ridley got that, I think, really well. So I had this idea in my head for a long time.
Well, it's interesting because I remember so much of the talk when Gladiator came out about how it very much revived an older form of Hollywood storytelling. When you look back at movies like Ben-Hur or Quo Vadis or so many of those films, I'm curious, when you were writing the film, if there was tropes you were trying to avoid in terms of bringing it up to date, making it feel, modern for its time.
Yeah, what was the idea? Of course, I think that take was incorrect. This is a film. Now, we spent a lot. I was on for like 90% of the shoot, so we would spend a lot of time, Ridley and I and Russell. We spent a lot of time talking about what this movie was, and I wrote a line, that for what's his name, the Oliver Reed character, Proximo, where he says, "I'm an entertainer," or not. It started out as "I'm an entertainer," and once that was in there, everyone sort of got it. That this wasn't, one of those craggy old movies from the 50s. This was about who we are and will become. And so avoiding, we didn't, okay, so the movies that Ridley and I talked about and looked at were La Dolce Vita, obviously from the beginning, All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yep.
And The Conformist by Bertolucci. Those are the movies, not Ben-Hur, blah, 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 blah. The problem with those movies, one of the big problems with those movies, and which we specifically said we were going to avoid, was religion. Because if we show Jews or Christians being abused in the arena or whatever, then the audience takes their side. But if they didn't have that choice, they had to be friggin' barbarians sitting in the Colosseum seats cheering on. They had to go there. And they did. So it was, yeah, we avoided that stuff, but we didn't. It wasn't that hard.
Okay.
I was just thinking about your answer there with the religion. It's interesting because obviously Maximus does have visions of going to what I assume he thinks is heaven, where his family is and things like that. So there is that religious undertone through the film. Is that a conscious thing, or is that just how you interpret it as potentially as a viewer?
No, I don't. I think it's okay that there's an afterlife. Like okay, so the original Ben-Hur, what's his face comes back, okay, so he comes back from the wars and the chariots and whatever, comes home and everybody's got leprosy or whatever the hell they got. And so the audience is going, oh my God, it's going to be a sad ending. But then Christ shows up and cures them all. That we didn't want that kind of religion. We didn't want an identifiable form of religion. So Maximus has his the statues of his ancestors, the statues of his ancestors that that Jaimon buries in the arena after his death. And this is really great. Like Ridley and I called it his long distance phone call to his family, because you have that scene where he's getting ready to retire, he's coming home, and he's got his ancestors, and then we see his family. Mm-hmm. Made no sense at all, but that's too bad. And and so in the afterlife, he goes to the pagan afterlife. That's fine.
Right.
Why not?
Well, I'm curious, you talk about working with Ridley Scott so closely. Ridley Scott is so often identified as one of the most important visual storytellers of his time. I'm really curious, from your point of view, how he is in terms of a story expert, because you don't hear people talk as much about Ridley Scott in terms of being a storyteller. I'm just curious, developing that story with him.
Okay, so with Ridley, it took me a while to understand this. Sometimes when you have something in mind for a story, like the subtext that we have, look, Maximus's story is very straightforward. It's not a revenge movie, which a lot of people say, it's a Clint Eastwood revenge. It's not. This is a man who who is working his life to protect the empire, and then when Marcus Aurelius dies, he refuses to take the responsibility of running it. So now he's forced to live the underbelly of that empire, which he doesn't know. And all he wants to do is get home. He's not trying to get even with anybody. It just so happens the way it's designed, getting even is getting home. So the whole subtext of what this was about, that's why we were talking about La Dolce Vita and the Conformist rather than Ben-Hur, is something that, and I'm only talking about the experience I had, something that Ridley clearly saw, and then made sure the visuals echoed what we were trying to do. So as a storyteller, is Van Gogh a storyteller? I think so. I mean, it's a different medium, but he's a storyteller with his visuals, which are brilliant. He's probably the greatest visual director of all time. Mm-hmm. He's amazing to work with. Amazing. Nothing like we were down in the provincial arena set, which was at a Ouarzazate, which is in the middle of freaking nowhere, right? And he's got like 5 or 6 cameras. Ridley, he can do like 30 cameras or whatever. He just doesn't. It's his medium. It's his paintbrush, right? So we're watching this sequence going on with the provincial gladiators, and he laughs. He calls me over to a monitor, and there's Oliver Reed standing there with a cigarette in his mouth, cheering on, right? Ridley's not going to throw a tantrum. He thought it was hilarious. And it was like there was that good, solid, I know where we're going, I know what we're doing, there's nothing to worry about feeling for everyone on that set because of Ridley.
Right.
I suppose the only thing that jumps out for me to ask in terms of Gladiator left is, it seems like this was one of the pieces of work that you were most involved with from conception to creation.
Right.
Is there a particular moment, looking back on it now, that you were proud of in the film? Like something you would point to as maybe the thing you were most involved with?
Well, okay, so I mean, look, I was rewritten, and okay, so there were some issues with the rewrite. Now, I'm not blaming the writer, actually. It was not his fault. But then, in fact, he sent me an email from London saying, look, when you're over here, let's sit down and go through this. Very generous, open. And I was a producer because, of course, I created it. So I was so they couldn't actually get rid of me, right? It's like, no matter how you try, you can't get rid of me. So I remember we met. Okay, part of the dynamic of the problem with the draft was, and it was very hard to sort of see, was that Russell had inadvertently been written out of the script, even though he was in every scene. And I said this, and everyone went, "No, you're wrong. It's perfect. We're all set to go." And then, during the read-through, Russell brought that up. He said, "Look, I've been written out of the script." And what it was that you have to remember. So Russell is in the provinces. Commodus is in Rome. So what you want is the shit to hit the fan after Maximus comes to Rome. And basically, until that moment, everything is smooth sailing for Commodus. What they had done was they started the whole rebellion against Commodus before Russell arrived. So the point was, and Russell was correct. Why am I here? Why am I in the movie if I'm not pushing the revolution? Which was correct. It wasn't a big change, but it was important. So I was happy that got done, and then I don't know. The whole process was great. We go after he got through shooting at the Ouazzezat Hotel. We go have dinner, smoke cigars, drink whiskey, talk about the next day's shooting. Because we would have shot this in order because he was working on the script. I go back to my room where my family was like, they were cashed out. Work on the script, give it to them at 3 a.m, and off they go. I loved it. It was fantastic.
Well, you mentioned Commodus a couple times there, and that's something that I always really appreciate in a movie is a very well-written antagonist. And he became an iconic one that people still reference. I'm just curious from you, your sort of thoughts on writing really strong antagonists. So like what's necessary?
Well, basically, and look, I wasn't the only writer working on the script. So John Logan was on it. But however, nevertheless, the character as well, I created the character, and the character had to be essentially, to be as strong a villain as he was, the mirror image of everything Maximus wasn't, or the mirror image of Maximus. It's like, he had to be somebody who almost, psychologically had to just be a motherfucker because his nemesis Maximus was so beloved. And so I think that's the essential basic foundations for having a great villain. Everybody says in order to have a great hero, you got to have a great villain. Well, that it works the other way around too. You got to have a great hero in order for there to be room for a great villain. But I think also that what made Joaquin's character so strong was that, now, remind you, the only historical work we have to go on is the Augustan histories. That's basically all. And that's been deemed mendacious. So we probably don't really know who the hell Commodus really was, right? But there's a great quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in Wind, Sand, and Stars, where he describes storytelling as a stone washed up on a beach, that over the centuries it'll become smoother and more perfect. And so Commodus, over the centuries, whoever he really was smoother and more perfect a villain than he ever probably really was. And so we're the beneficiaries of receiving that wonderful stone that he had become. And he was somebody who was going to do whatever the fuck he wanted with Rome. He didn't want to hear about the barbarian front. He didn't want to hear about defending this or that. He just wanted to basically live a life of luxury. It's, and this is a very Donald Trump, thing, and rule over those people who didn't understand what the hell was going on. And that was his domain. And into that domain comes Maximus, who not only is his antagonist, but becomes the hero of the machine that keeps Maximus in power. So now he's got a problem. He can't kill Maximus because he'll destroy the machine that keeps him in power. That was how that worked. So, that was the sort of mechanic. Look, the characters have to emerge. The story has to emerge from character. You don't go through writing a story. I never outline. You go through and you write the character, and then everything starts making sense.
Mm-hmm. So I had just one question I really had about King Arthur. I thought King Arthur was a really interesting attempt to kind of update the Arthurian legend. It didn't really connect with, audiences, maybe like it should have. I'm just curious for you if it felt like that movie was just like missing some sort of spark that, like, say, Gladiator had, where where did it not quite go right?
Okay, the original, when I was first talking to Jerry Bruckheimer about this, the original, and Mike Stenson and Chad Ullman, the whole crowd, right? The original idea was, this is the fall of Vietnam. The NVA and the Viet Cong are moving south. A special forces unit is sent north above the DMZ to rescue a family or these people and bring them back. Merlin is Ho Chi Minh. His fighters are the Viet Cong. That was the idea. It was supposed to be a big little story, not overblown. I think it just got out of control, and we lost sight of, because in the original script there was a scene where they were hating on each other, and that got taken out. And I think it was important that scene be in there because that scene was the one that defined their relationship. Also, I'm not sure you know this, but there really was a Lucius Artorius Castus. And he probably was the basis for King Arthur. And so there's a new book coming out by John Matthews and Linda Malcor about that. Well, for instance, we were taken to court because we said, we had the audacity to say that this is probably where Arthur came from. So I had to give all my research, which was actually everybody else's research, Linda Malcor and Littleton and everybody else, give that to the court. I'm not making this up, right?
Yeah. It sounds like us, to be fair.
Yeah. And they found for us, which pissed them off even more, right? It's like, they said, no, this makes total sense where this could come from. Look, Avalon, when Arthur goes probably to die at the end of the Arthurian legends, where the great Roman officers were sent in Italy to be cured was Avalonia. I mean, every of the 11 battles that Arthur is supposed to have fought, 10 can be traced back to Lucius Artorius Castus. I mean, this wasn't just idle fantasy. The Sarmatians, okay, this is the fun part. So the battle in Vindibonia and in Vienna at the beginning of Gladiator, at that battle, a force of Sarmatian cavalry was taken prisoner. One part of it was sent to Egypt, and we never know what happened to them, and the other was sent to England, to the UK, with Lucius Artorius Castor as their commander. And they lived there for over 100 years, now obviously with Lucius, as a separate social entity. They were unique unto themselves. And the Sword and the Stone is Sarmatian. The Grail, right? The goblet. Well, there is a goblet in Sarmatian history which was always being hunted and always desired because it was full of opium. So it's like, you can say, well, that's a coincidence, but I find that hard to buy that that's a coincidence. There's a lot more to it. There's the King Arthur, who was a literary conceit, a literary concept, which is completely separate. We're just talking about historical bones. So what I thought was, okay, we have this guy. He's a British commander. I mean, a Roman commander. He wants to get the hell out of there. England is falling. The soldiers are retreating. He's got one last mission. He has to go north of the DMZ, fight the Viet Cong, bring back this family. But what happens is, he meets Guinevere and he becomes an indigenous English fighter himself. That was the original idea.
Interesting. Now, Scott, do you want to jump over to some of our spy-related topics?
Absolutely. Before we wrap up with the spy questions, when I do my research for this, I always look through IMDb, and one thing that jumped out to me is Gladiator 2.
Hmm.
And you're down as a producer for this. It says announced. Apart from that, I mean, do you have any information on that? I know there's probably embargo with contracts everywhere. You couldn't say anything, but is it still in production somewhere? Or
I don't think about it. I mean, I'm a producer because I create it, so it's kind of hard to just keep me off. I've been offered money to go away. I don't think about it. Look, I'm sure that there's a lot of talented people working on it. I'm sure whatever they're doing is terrific, but I don't know what it is.
I don't know how you follow up on Gladiator personally. I don't understand that, but that's just me. I don't make films.
Tell me they're remaking Seven Samurai right now?
Yeah.
Really?
What? Called Eight Samurai.
Let's not get into remakes. I'll be here all day. Well, we always wrap up our interviews with some questions about spy movies because that's what we talk about every week. So the first question I always ask is, what is your favorite spy movie?
Well, I have two levels of that.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of early Bond, from Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Dr. No. Those are just obscene fun. And yet, they do manage to capture some of the feel of the espionage. And that's because, of course, of who wrote the books. And, but as far as more serious fare goes, again, they're from books. My two favorite are Smiley's People and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with Ellen Gibbs.
Okay, now I think you probably answered this question already, but you would say that after 50 plus years of James Bond, that Sean Connery is your Bond, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I know Pierce; he's great. The thing about Sean Connery was that he had this ironic attitude, which always said, "I don't believe I'm in this ridiculous movie, but let's just do it." There was something magnificently ironic about his attitude that none of the others have actually captured. That's why I love it.
Yeah, we're big fans of him as well.
Yeah.
I suppose spinning off of that, because you are a writer, if they say now after this most recent Bond film that's coming out potentially in a few months' time that they want to do something different with the franchise, say they called you up and said, what should we do next? What would be your idea and where would you take the Bond franchise moving forward?
Well, I would definitely go in the direction of Smiley's People or Tinker Tailor Soldier. We've got the circus. I mean, they always have a bit of the circus in the Bond films, but let's face it, the biggest problems for MI6 and MI5 back in the day were themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I would go there. I mean, there's a project I'm working on with Mike Medavoy right now at A&E called the Ossenberg File. And Ossenberg was a cleric, and that's a clerk who stood between wackos and Hitler. And what he would do is so if you're Werner von Braun and you want money for your V1 idea, you go to Ossenberg. He would then submit the proposal to Hitler, get approvals, and pay him. So by the end of the war, he had everybody on there, right? People who are insane, people who are dangerous, people who you wanted. So it's slightly retro rather than today, or it could be today. Let's put it this way. It could very well be today, but you could take those old attitudes and put them in today. The secretaries who are keeping things from you, which they kind of did with Bond, with Moneypenny. But, other members of your own organization who are lying to you, maybe some who are cheating. I mean, there is something wonderful about an organ that is eating itself alive. And that if you come back, like Bond comes back from dealing with whatever, the Inuit gun insane or something, right? He comes back from some great Bond film-like thing on the outside, to that, where everything is going to hell in a handbag. That's where I'd go. I'd go in on itself. All these meetings you have with M and, talking about the scotch and these big rooms and Panelman wood with, people's shields and all that. But bring it down. That's what's great about Smiley's, that little room they always met in, the circus always met in, was kind of like this condensed version of the mead hall, right? And it's sort of like the bourbon hall or something, right? I would go there. That's all. I mean,
I think it's a great idea. I think that the modern Bond films are a bit scared to go small scale. I think they all just want to go bombastic and have Daniel Craig charging through walls, which is fun, but there's other stuff in the spy universe other than just martinis.
Yeah, I mean, in the Ossenberg one, they come back with a German professor named Valen, who was supposedly defecting from Vichy France. This is during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been studying reverse continuity. So it's like our introduction in that series. Hopefully we're going to move forward with it. To the madness of simple science. And what he does is he's part of a plot to destroy MI5, and he tries to destroy them with reverse continuity. So what we do with the audience is we introduce this very sort of bureaucratic, cliched, plebeian world of don't forget to sign that 6 times, and don't forget we had to fill out that in triplicate, that stuff, with like reverse continuity trying to destroy MI5.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around that. That's a hell of a Bond film right there.
Well, it could be, yes, but this is the problem for me with the Bond films. They never quite go far enough.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. We spoke to Nicholas Meyer some time ago, and he said something very similar when he pitched a Bond film in the 90s, one of them, and his answer to the villain problem was for that, basically. That not exactly that pitch, different, but you can kind of see the elements there. It's just interesting. The creative minds are thinking that.
Well, I think the thing is that we've been brought up, with what's his name, the guy who defected to the Russians. We're aware of that, and that's where the most harm can be done.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, we're going to go set a bomb off in Cleveland. Okay, well, maybe it's a good idea. So. But the issue is we're going to destroy every foundation that you have for saving the West. That's what's really scary.
Right. Okay, so you've talked, about the project you're working on. Is there anything else people should be on the lookout for in the future?
Well, I'm doing a wonderful project with Robert Rodriguez, and it's about the Aztec and before the Spanish. It's a great project. Annie's in, and it deals with a world that we just don't know. We've never met. Never met. I mean, completely. Women were very powerful. They sat in the Council of Nobles that chose the king. Look, Tenochtitlan had zoos. It had aquariums. They had schools. Even slaves were required to go to school, and the slaves could be emancipated. Set against this barbaric, sacrificial shit. That was sacrificial. It's getting into the depth of that is so much goddamn fun. So there's that. What else am I working on? There's a couple of things I can't talk about. There's a film I'm working on called Blindsided that I'm just handing the script and I'm really proud of. It's about a court case, a very simple court case, and what I've made it about the relationships. I mean, it's giant in its themes and tiny and profound in its real elements. And that. Anyway, so I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what they'll make? I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that I have on the front and back burner that I'm working on. It's getting them made.
For sure.
Lafayette is like one of my favorites.
Well, I mean, David, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Jumpin' Jack Flash was one of the first films that we tackled on this podcast, and I always rate it as a sort of a hidden 80s gem. I think the cast is fantastic, and I think it's a really funny film. And I think the story behind it's also pretty good too, and it turns out that your story was even better. So thank you for enlightening us with this this information that I don't think anyone knew.
Okay, well, thanks for giving it a shot.
Again, so yeah, thank you, David, for joining us. Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Thanks.
Well, that was David Franzoni, and it was certainly a gas.
Now, Scott, I put on my spy-like analytical goggles, and I think he may be a history buff.
Yeah, I think he gave some sly hints. Now, I do play a bit of some card games at the casinos. I understand tells, and he was showing some tells about his enjoyment of history, specifically English history.
Yeah, and I mean, you knew all this, right? Like, this was a lot of stuff that they taught you right in grade school.
I mean, the Congolese War is basically, we learned that in what you would call kindergarten.
Mm.
Yeah. And then we move straight on to Arthurian legends.
Not the other way around, dude, the way you'd think it would be.
Well, this is how you end up like me.
Right.
Completely uneducated.
Right. I thought the background that when he talked about the development of Jumpin' Jack Flash was incredible. Like, to hear the real world parallels he was making, the thought that went behind all of the decisions in a movie that I think a lot of people would have seen maybe on TV in the afternoon and thought, it's a silly Whoopi Goldberg film, whatever. It was fascinating just to hear how much thought and research was being done in terms of setting up that story.
And we've been blessed to talk to quite a few screenwriters so far, and we've got some more coming up down the line. And it's really interesting just to hear how these stories start off and then they get put through the meat grinder that is Hollywood, and then you get a completely different thing at the end. It's like the whole chicken McNuggets. It starts off as an actual chicken and ends up as a pink blob.
Yeah, and this was David's first film, first produced screenplay. And so not a lot of power there. Like, when you have worked on Gladiator and you're a producer on Gladiator and you write the screenplay for that film, that's something that once you're being attached to projects, they go, oh, whoa, okay, the writer of Gladiator, fair enough. Even then, you're probably going to be rewritten in Hollywood, but nonetheless, you have a lot more clout than what he would have had in 1980, probably 5 or 4, when he is, writing the screenplay for Jumpin' Jack Flash.
And I actually rewatched Jumpin' Jack Flash, so I've now watched it a grand total of 3 times for this podcast. Go me! To just refresh my memory about the film, and it was interesting to ask him about like how the characters started off, because firstly, it wasn't a comedy.
Yeah, well, it was open to interpretation as a comedy.
Sure, some people thought it was funny, and I get the whole office setting being quite funny. I've worked in offices before; they can be hilarious at times, but life isn't a series of skits, and so I understand where he was coming from with that angle. But the whole idea of Terry Doolittle had a boyfriend,
yeah,
which sort of evolved into the Stephen Collins character, I guess. It seems like it anyway.
I think we talked about with that film that it had a lot of the elements of like the 80s fairy tale, which is so many movies of that era where they have that kind of sort of the romantic element, very like rom-com type of setup that kind of pays off in a fairy tale ending, which is what Jumpin' Jack Flash does with the Jonathan Pryce character. And you just kind of get the sense like that sort of almost fantasy-like rom-com element wasn't really there initially.
Yeah, and one thing we also touched on that I found interesting was just the ending. Originally, the Terry Doolittle character, Whoopi Goldberg's inevitable character, does meet Jack at the airport at the end. But like, from what I could tell of what he said, it was like you would almost see them in a distance. You don't really have an exchange between the two. Whereas in reality, we got this strange scene of of Jonathan Pryce talking to Whoopi Goldberg from one side of the room using their computers that show video. And then a very creepy Jonathan Pryce walking up behind Whoopi Goldberg and stroking her face. That still creeped me out even on the third watch, I have to say.
And it's not just that it's Jonathan Pryce who doesn't really fit the bill in terms of what Mr. Franzoni was talking about in terms of how he saw the character, but it's the fact
take that back. He's a warrior. He's a champion.
It's that when he shows up, he's in no way threatening and he's not mysterious. Like, he's wearing this sort of dorky orange 80s vest. Is it? Yeah, right. And there's nothing like, there's no mystique to that image. It's a very kind of, he looks like a guy who would just be on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like an average Joe. And his whole concept behind the Jack character is that you build up this image in your mind of this guy who's seen things, he's been through things, he's in trouble, he needs help, but he's a capable soldier nonetheless. And so you would expect 80s action star, maybe Sly Stallone or something, to walk up and be like, hey, I'm Jack.
And then yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean
that would have made the computer voice very different, I have to say.
He cited Steve McQueen as an example of what he had in mind, and I was like racking my brain because I feel like, did we have that many Steve McQueen types in the 80s? I think maybe like Harrison Ford is the closest to that. But even then, Steve McQueen had a real like hard living kind of style to him as well. Like, it's that world weary kind of look. And I don't know if there's many actors who jumped to my mind when he said that. I wondered even if you'd use more of a character actor, almost like a Gene Hackman or something.
I don't know what's worse, Gene Hackman or Jonathan Pryce.
Well,
who do you want stroking your head?
Well, is Gene Hackman doing it as Lex Luthor from the Superman film? That's okay.
Yes, yeah, it's full Lex Luthor, bald Gene Hackman.
Although he was only bald in like one scene because he wouldn't shave his head for the movie. Yeah.
I think I'd choose Jonathan Pryce just because I love Jonathan Pryce.
From everything I've heard, he's a nicer man. Gene Hackman, little prickly, I think.
But yeah, I think it was just a fascinating exploration of what could have been with the film, and also a celebration of what was good about the film. I think a lot of the strong story beats the film had came from his original idea. And he said, the comedy was just sort of added on top. And you can really see that in the film. There are sections where it's basically played straight, and then Whoopi will make a joke. But that's not really the story. That's just Whoopi making a joke about the scenario. And so that you can see how that was just like icing on a cake, basically. I'm not saying it was a great cake. It's not a knock list cake, but a cake.
Sure. A cake that Ray Milland would really enjoy in the Adventures of Ministry of Fear. Yes.
What a connection.
Thank you. But also that when you watch Jumpin' Jack Flash, the comedy is hit or miss depending on, where you sit. You may find the movie not funny at all. But the spy plot holds up fairly well. Like, the dots are connected. When you get to the end, it feels like you've more or less watched a cohesive, somewhat complicated spy story. And he had issues with it being a spy, seeing this as a spy film. That's fine. I think for the purposes of this podcast, it falls into the spy film kind of genre. So we're gonna bend for that one. But it felt like, in terms of what he would have set up initially, at least, that there was a foundation there in terms of a spy narrative.
And then obviously we also spoke about some of his other notable works. You spoke to him about Amistad, a film I haven't seen yet, but I've put it on my list to catch up on. Did you garner any information from that you liked?
Yeah, it was a movie that I saw it back when it first hit video. I didn't see it in theaters, but it had the misfortune of opening during the Titanic craze. So Amistad was very overlooked. It was nominated for a few Oscars. Anthony Hopkins got a supporting actor, but it didn't get a Best Picture, or Best Director, or Best Screenplay, anything like that. In a different year, it might have squeaked in. It is viewed as something of a lesser Spielberg, but it's during that era where Spielberg is still making great stuff consistently. So it's only being held up in comparison to some of the other movies of that era, especially Schindler's List, which a lot of people at the time saw as it sort of being the next in line of sort of the more serious Spielberg history-based narratives. And it doesn't measure up to Schindler's List, which is one of the great films of its time. But watching it last night for the first time in, over 20 years, I was really drawn into, there's so many sequences that just show Spielberg's mastery of visual storytelling. And the movie has a very difficult balance. And it's something I touched on in the interview, in that when you look at Gladiator, when you look at Jumpin' Jack Flash, they have very clear protagonists that you follow through the movie. The story of Amistad is very complex. There are so many characters throughout the film, but he has to keep the focus on the Jaimin Hansu main character of the story. Like, how do you build all of these complicated events being driven by all these other actors, but still keep it focused on your main character? And I thought that was really interesting to hear him talk about.
Yeah, it's certainly given me an extra push to go watch the film, so I'm glad for that. And we, of course, touched on the film he won an Oscar for Best Film, which is Gladiator. That's probably in my top 10 films of all time.
Yeah, it was great to hear him talk about his collaborations with Ridley Scott, someone who I just don't hear a lot of screenwriters talk about. Ridley Scott being someone that necessarily invested in narrative versus more of the visual world and storytelling. So it was really fascinating to hear him kind of back up and say that, no, Ridley Scott really has a very strong storytelling sense. Then I think it's quite clear from their collaboration that it at least really came across in Gladiator.
And I'm glad that, coming on from Jumpin' Jack Flash and having his story kind of chewed up a little bit, changed, that later on with his films that he's done since, he was able to stay with the production longer and help guide it to its goal. And obviously it's worked for him.
Mm-hmm.
He's got an Oscar. Not every screenwriter can say that.
Yeah, because producing Gladiator was a great thing for him, and the fact that he was a producer on Gladiator ensured a certain amount of creative control. Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall it was a great chat, and I learned a ton about Jumpin' Jack Flash. I still enjoy it. I don't think it would make the knock list looking back on it again, but it's certainly an interesting piece of work for its time. It certainly feels like it's an 80s film, and it's maybe a bit of a hidden gem. I think if you haven't seen Jumpin' Jack Flash and you like spy comedies, it's actually quite fun. I would again say check it out.
The world of spy comedies is riddled with landmines that we are going to be setting off as we continue down this journey. So I agree. Like, I think Jumpin' Jack Flash, even if you don't find it that funny necessarily, there's conceptual things that I think are much more interesting than a lot of the other movies we're going to tackle that are like, what if James Bond was stupid? We're going to run into a lot of those types of movies, whereas this one felt like it had an angle on an original premise that a lot of the other films won't.
Well, what if James Bond was stupid? I think you speak to him every week about spy movies. Hello.
But I'm the Felix Leiter, and I'm also stupid.
You're the Jack Lord version with the sunglasses.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you all for listening. Don't forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners. Oh, sorry, the British National Anthem's playing. I have to stand up. See ya.